Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. And I'm sure all of you have also an interest on the stingless bees and the stingless bee honey as well. So I'm happy to share with you some of my findings and some standards that I compiled on internationally and locally in Malaysia and also Australia for comparison. And Tim Hurt here is also part of the Australian Native Bee Association. I think you're the head, right, of the ANBA, actually. Okay, so basically I'm going to go through a little bit on introduction, compare all the different standards that are available now, especially focusing on bees, and look at how my preliminary study on the samples that I got from Malaysian samples and the Australian samples, and how they comply towards the standards that are available. And I'm also going to focus on natural toxicants, the Pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which can be found in the honey. And last but not least, we're going to look at what a possible way that we can work on, focus on towards standardizations of the stingless bee honey, and whether it's worth it or not. Okay, so a little bit on stingless bees if you're not familiar with the bees. They're actually from the order Hymenoptera, from the family of Apidae and the tribe of Meliponidae. So in some countries they call it as, or in even scientific papers, they call it as meliponin, bees from meliponins, honey from meliponin bees. And it's a very highly diverse group of social bees that's been here for around more than 100 million years ago, actually. And they have been domesticated, used for pollination, and they are also used for production of honey and their byproducts. I'm going to show to you what their byproducts later. They're also most diverse and very useful of all the insects group in the tropical regions for over 65 million years. What they do is they collect the nectar, the pollen grains from plants and from flowers, and the resins from the bark of trees, and as the raw materials of bee products to produce all the honey, bee bread, and the propolis. Okay, so this picture shows you how diverse they are. If you look at the species, all different sizes and different patterns, different shapes. They all have this elongated narrow tunnel as an entrance to their nest. Okay, so this is basically common for all bees, for all stingless bees. And this is the pollens where they collect. This is actually the Australian Carbonaria species, taking pollen from the lotus plant. And this is also the same species actually in the hives. This is where they keep their youngs. And then this is an army. They are different. They have different social status. So these are all the army bees. They're guarding the entrance to the nest. And this is the stingless bee comparison to other bees. So it's a bit smaller than other bees. And this is an example of a stingless bee collecting resin from the bark of a tree. So this is what they use to make the propolis and this entrance for their nest. Okay, so in terms of their distribution around the world, they usually found in the tropical or subtropical regions, American tropics or neotropic. Mostly Brazil have a lot of species of stingless bees. In fact, they don't call it, they have a specific local name for each of the species of the stingless bees. Like they don't call it as stingless bees as a whole. So that's how diverse and how useful the bees is in Brazil. And there are some in sub-Saharan, Indo-Australian, including Malaysia, and of course the northern parts of Australia, which are home to many species of stingless bees. And until now, around 500 species of stingless bees have been discovered, and maybe there's more that has not yet been discovered. So, and talk about stingless bee honey, maybe I should ask the audience if some of you have ever tasted stingless bee honey before. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 out of around 13 or 14 people. Okay, so now how about, have you tasted native bee honeys? Okay, so different people. How about sugar bag honeys? Have you ever tasted sugar bag or sweat bees honeys? They're actually all the same. So they're actually all the different names that people call, but actually they're all stingless bee, honey from the stingless bees. And in Malaysia, they're called kalulut. And then that's why I said in Brazil, there are lots of different names for the stingless bees according to the species. So there are many names for the stingless bees. So this is where they they put their honey in pots. So it's different than the European bee honeys, which they put it in honeycombs. So this is the pots where they make and store their honeys. The production per colony can be low and to high production. Some colonies can even though they contain less than 1,000 bees, they can produce up to 4 liters of honey per year. So that's actually a lot for production per colony. But some, of course, produce less. So it depends also on the size of the bees as well. So the bigger the bees, sometimes they produce more honeys. There are also different species, and they also produce different composition with distant and organoleptic properties, usually a strong acid flavor, and they also have the low viscosity, so they're not very thick, very runny. Okay, and they're widely used traditionally as therapeutic effects and contain lots of substances, including polyphenols, vitamin, minerals, flavonoids, organic acids, and etc. So this is an example of a picture of honey, and this is a bee bread. Okay, so this is where what they used to feed their young, but sometimes there's a lot of bee bread. So, and some people take the bee bread as medicines, as traditional medicine. And this is a propolis, is where what they use to make the structures in their hives. Okay. So we'll look at the economic potential of a stingless bee. In Malaysia, there's currently a market for stingless bee honey, with the bee honey, bee bread, and propolis valued around $28 USD dollars. Per kilogram, 35 and 60 respectively. And usually the consumers in Malaysia use this product for therapeutic and cosmetics purposes. It's actually, compared to the other honeys in Malaysia, it's quite expensive. So, but people think because it's been used traditionally, it might have therapeutic effects. So this is an example of company in Malaysia. So they turn the honey or propolis or bee bread into soap, any other, like here you can see the cream, scrub, serum gels, okay, and all those kinds of cosmetics. In Australia, also the current market can reach up to $200 according to Tim Hurt. Okay, and demands are actually high from the chefs because of the unique flavor. So sometimes people want to have different, menus. So they would put it in addition to other food ingredients and use the honeys, stingless bee honeys for their new creations of food. Okay, so when we talk about the stingless bee honey standards, there are many drivers that actually can that actually contribute to the development of the standards. So of course the beekeepers, of course, should be involved in the making of the standards. Companies, business entities that produce products and as sold as food as well. The scientists who are doing studies on the honeys and also on the bees as well can can play a role in making that standard. Agriculture related government agencies, especially, they should look into the beekeepers or farmers and how they manage their farms and everything. and maybe put like a standard for that as well. Food safety related government agencies especially is very important in terms of making that standards. Of course, food standards are under food safety government agencies, such as here in Australia you have FSANZ, right, for that. And of course, consumers also are very important. As long as consumers are aware and they feel that the standard is very important, this is what drives the standards more quicker or quickly to be implemented. Okay, so so we're going to look at the standards as a whole and what they say about honey, or are there any clause regarding stingless bee honey? So first we look at what is the purpose of legislation. Okay, so honey trade in many parts of the world is governed by regulations, and this is to ensure that the product sold as honey really is honey, okay, and not an adulterated substance or can be false honey. And it's also to ensure that the honey is actually safe to eat, and it's also to ensure that the honey is not contaminated with anything that is harmful. Okay, so the purpose of regulation is actually to maintain the standards and keep consumers safe. And currently now in different parts of the world, different regulations apply for honeys. Okay, so first we look at the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the Codex, which is actually the dominant standard, okay, established in 1963 by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and also the World Health Organization. So the Codex standards actually adopted in 1981, was revised in 1987, 2001, and currently this year they've revised the standard. And they put this is actually the minimum standard for the honey to enter international market. So regions and countries also develop their own standard based on the Codex standards. Okay, however, currently the Codex and also other national honey standard, except for the Malaysian standard for stingless bee, does not recognize stingless bee honey in their provisions. So let me show you how, why it's not mentioned in the provision. So if you look at the Codex definition, the definition of honeys in the Codex standards actually here is honey that are produced by honeybees. So when we say honeybees, it usually refers to the family Apis, the genus Apis mellifera, so the European honeybees. And also, if you here again, it's mentioned as honeybees. So that's why stingless bees is not actually in the standard Codex definition. And for FSANZ, the Food Standard Australia and New Zealand, also have similar definitions of honey, which here it's mentioned that honey is a natural sweet substance produced by honeybees again, and living part, which are actually secretions from living parts of plants, secretion of plant-sucking insects, which honeybees collect, and also the word mentioning honeycomb in here, which clearly is different from the pots where the honey pots where stingless bees store their honeys. So it's clearly not mentioned here in the FSANZ definition of honey. So Malaysian have prepared the Malaysian standard in 2017, which actually focuses on stingless bee honey, and it's called Kalulut here because this is what we call it in Malaysia. It's like the local name for stingless bee honey, so it's called Kalulut honey specification. So prepared by Department of Standards Malaysia, and here it's directly addressing Kalulut stingless bee honey as a natural sweet substance that are also stored and live in natural honey pots to ripen and mature. And they also differentiate between the raw honey, processed honey, the definition of the honey, and differentiated between processed and also raw Kalulut honey. So this is very specific actually and refers to the stingless bees and stingless bee honey itself. Okay, so like in terms of the physicochemical properties, okay, there are also requirements by the standards on certain physicochemical parameters. So I marked it as asterisk those that are required. These are actually voluntary properties that you can add for your honey labels, in the honey labels. But those that are mandatory are in asterisk. So if you look at here, the Codex actually require moisture content, not more than 20%. Reducing sugars, minimum 60, so it has to be more than 60. Okay, and the sucrose, which should not be high in honeys, because that is a signal of adulteration as well. So it shouldn't be more than 5 grams per 100 gram. And FSANZ also have this similar requirement to Codex. And if you compare it to the Malaysian standard, the MS 2683, the moisture content mentioned here should not be more than 35% in raw honey. This is regarding to raw honey. And pH also has been standardized to 2.5 to 3.8. And maximum of ash also has been set to 1%. And HMF has also been standardized to be not more than 30 milligram per kg. Reducing sugars, maximum 85. So this is different than the Codex and the FSANZ standard, which says that it should be a minimum of 60. But for the Malaysian standard, it says that maximum 80. So there can be any amounts as long as it doesn't reach more than 85 grams per 100 grams. Sucrose is a little bit different, should be more than 7.5. And also they've standardized on maltose and has to be presence of plant phenolics as well. So yeah, there's a lot of requirement here in the Malaysian standards. Okay, so we're going to look at what are the contaminants and natural toxicants that are regulated in terms of honey. In the Codex, I'm just going to show you those that are really specific to honey itself. There are many other food acts that actually generalize the contaminants that should not be in all foods. So these are all that are very specific to honeys. So Codex doesn't allow heavy metals and pesticides. It should be very low amounts. Okay, so they set a limit for heavy metals and pesticides and veterinary drugs. And the FSANZ have a special section on tutin, which is a natural toxicant that can occur in honey. I think there was an outbreak here a while ago in New Zealand. Yeah, in New Zealand a while ago. So this was an outbreak that occurs when the bees collect the honeydew from this passion from the passion vine hoppers that feeds on these tutu plants. So this is a picture of a tutu plant, and this is actually the fruits plant from the plant, and so considered a poisonous type of plants. So this is a very specific mentioning on the natural toxicant tutin that shouldn't be allowed to be present in the honey. Okay, so when I was here last year for 9 months, I collected samples from the Australian Stingless Bee Honey, and I also I posted the honey from Malaysia as well to compare the physicochemical properties and also natural toxicants in them. Okay, so I'm going to share with you how they comply towards the standards that I've shown you earlier. Okay, so first I'm going to introduce you to the bees that produce this honey. So this is a Malaysian stingless bee species, the Heterotrigona itama. They're about 5 millimeters in size. And the Geneotrigona thoracica is a bit bigger than the Heterotrigona itama. So basically, the bigger they are, the further they would go for finding nectars and pollens and resins. Okay, they also have different behaviors. They sometimes choose on different plants for feedings. Okay, basically for the Heterotrigona itama, around 500 meters from the hives. Okay, so for the Australian stingless bee species, ones that I collect the honeys from are Tetragonula carbonaria. They're a bit smaller compared to the Malaysian species. Tetragonula hawkinsi, not very common. The most common ones are the Tetragonula carbonaria that's being kept in in backyards here, but not the tetragonal hawkins are not very properly kept around Brisbane and Queensland area. So these are the locations where I've collected my samples from. I've collected from northern, middle, and southern parts of Peninsular Malaysia, and one of the samples are actually from the Borneo part of Malaysia. And from the Queensland, most of the honeys are collected from around Brisbane cities, from beekeepers around Brisbane cities, and also some samples are from Bargara, which is in central Queensland. And the sampling method is actually similar, but not exactly the same. Fresh honey are collected from the hives. Of course, there are different methods. You can ask Tim Hurd, his collection method. Okay, so sampling are done actually between January to June 2018. Okay, so we look at the physical properties of these samples. And here are all the variables that I looked at and compared between these two. If you remember from Australia, Carbonaria and Hawkinside. And this Itama and Thoracica is from the Malaysian stingless bees. These are other Malaysian stingless bees. So these are all the physicochemical properties of the honeys. Okay, so I compare all these properties to the Codex standard. Okay, so when we look at the levels that Codex has set for moisture, none of the samples met that or comply that requirement for moisture content. We're just going to look at those that are required. So sucrose, basically very low, is not detected very much, so that actually complies. So but for reducing sugars, if you total the amount of fructose and glucose, okay, doesn't reach 60 grams per 100 grams, which is the requirement for Codex standard. So all the others are actually voluntarily variables that can be added voluntarily. But even though if you look at the ash and which means the total mineral and free acidity, also doesn't meet their standards. However, the standards for electrical conductivity was met. Okay. So and then I compared also to the FSANZ standard, okay, which actually requires these two, moisture and reducing sugars, okay, to have actually below 20% and reducing sugars more than 60 grams. So this also doesn't comply, okay, to the FSANZ standard for honey. Okay. Okay, how about the Malaysian standard? So basically they all turn green. Okay. Because of I think the minimum and the maximum values changed to accommodate stingless bee honeys. So actually, okay, so moisture, you can see here, all fits within the recommended requirements, including the ash, the pH, phenolic contents is just present, so it doesn't matter how much they are, they should be present. And reducing sugars, because the set of reducing sugars is maximum, so any amount that is below the maximum of 85 is considered as complying to the Malaysian standards. Okay, so, okay, however, there are some beekeepers that also think that there's too many things, they have too many analyses to be done on the honey, and that could be very costly, even though it can fit actually the honeys can fit the standard, so that's another issue. Okay, so how about the contaminants and natural toxicants? I also done the analysis on this. Actually, it's been done by the staff at DAF. Okay, so they look at we look at the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon properties, which is actually environmental pollutants. So actually, they're all safe levels, less than 0.1 nanograms. So they're very low, just to see that they're diverse, so many different types of paths, and maybe more in the urban area, okay? But still, it's very low content. So then we look at the pyrrolizidine alkaloids in the stingless bee honey. And surprisingly, we found there are new PAs that has never been discovered before. And these supernin or can be isomer supernin. So we're not sure yet what is PAs are. So we add as isomers of angilyretronesin or acetylsupenin isomers and supernin isomers. And actually all of these percentage are based of a total of 27 microgram of the PAs per gram of honey. Okay, so now this is for all of the stingless honeys in the sample. So now we're going to look at, based on the Queensland stingless bee honey samples, the percentage of honey, of the PAs found in these Queensland honeys, just 0.44 microgram. And all of the PAs actually have been discovered before by Mary Fletcher and Natasha Hungerford and at the Queensland, at the QAAFI. Okay, basically the new PAs are discovered in the Malaysian honeys, where the percentage is around 26, the percentage is from 26.56 microgram of PAs in a gram of honey. And this is mostly, okay, the PAs are supernin isomers, which is 55%, and also acetylsupenin isomers. Okay, so there might be a difference because the sample, usually the PAs are from weeds, which I'm going to explain later in the pyrrolizidine section. Okay, so this is actually very alarming for us in Malaysia as well. Okay, so if you look at the different stingless bee species, according to the species, most of the species that actually produce these PAs, this honey-containing PAs are the Heterotrigona itama honeys, which is 96% of the total 27 microgram of PAs. Surprisingly, the Tetragonolacus only produce around 1%, so just 1% out of 5 samples. So it can be species variation, even though actually some of the samples that I took, of the honey samples I took in the farm that have both of these species together. So both of these species in same farms, but they have different amount of PAs in the honeys, means that they probably go to different flowers to collect the nectars from. Okay, so other contaminants was also analyzed, but we do not find any toxic levels of arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. And we also analyzed the pesticide and herbicides, but they also found to be non-toxic. Okay, so I'm going to explain more on the pyrrolizidine alkaloids, and possibly those of you who are here can maybe have an idea on what they are and whether they should be standardized. Okay, so first we look at what are natural toxins. So basically, okay, they're natural compounds. They're not harmful to the organisms themselves, okay, but they can be toxic to other creatures, including us, humans. And these chemical compounds have very diverse structures, and they can be produced actually as a natural defense mechanism against predators. So actually it's a planned mechanism of defense. And there are other sources of natural toxins other than those microscopic algae, for example, okay, in the oceans. Okay, so there are many other toxins around. So the pyrrolizidine alkaloids are toxins produced by around 600 plant species, mainly from the families of Boraginaceae, Asteraceae, and Fabaceae, and usually from weeds that grow in the fields and contaminate food crops. Okay, so for those stingless bee honey that I collected from Australia, mostly are from the background or from the backyards of houses. So most likely that people clean their backyards from weeds. But the Malaysian honeys are actually taken from bee farms. So they're actually quite large, and the area is also big. And because Malaysia is a tropical country, it will be likely lots of weeds around. So that's why it's the threat is actually higher in bee farms, where the beekeepers may not may not be able to control the weeds that are growing in the farms. Okay, so there are a variety of health effects that actually can lead to cancer. They are also stable during processing, and they, other than honeys, they have also been detected in herbal teas, herbs and spices. And although human exposure is estimated to be low in all these food products, however, long time and intermittent low-level intake of PA-contaminated foodstuffs and exposure, okay, especially towards fetus and children, is a major concern because our body cannot metabolize the PAs. So it's usually accumulated in the liver. Okay, so regarding the international regulation of PAs in honey, actually there are no regulation yet. The FAO and the WHO has a task force which is the committee, the FAO WHO Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food, and they are looking currently discussing, trying to find out the best way to regulate these PA and prevent these PAs from entering the food chain. So basically, they're still under development. Okay. Okay. So the FSANZ regulation on PAs also has not been established yet. So the FSANZ have only established a safe level of intake for these alkaloids. It's around 1 microgram per kilogram of body weight per day. Okay, so because this is based on the known toxicity that's found in humans. Okay, however, of course, for babies and children, so the amounts have to be lower than that. However, the FSANZ has not established a regulatory level because there's no current evidence of harm from normal consumptions of the PAs. Okay, and in Malaysia, there's no actually regulation at all on Pyrrolizidine alkaloids as well. So it can be something to think about when we're creating this standard, whether it should be a safe level to assess the Pyrrolizidine alkaloids in the honeys. So last but not least, so when we look at the towards standardization, what are the benefits of standardization is that we can get a uniform definition of the stingless bee honey. I mean, because in other parts of the world, they're called by a different name. So maybe outbreaks or of certain toxins that affect humans are not being reported as stingless bee honey because they've been called by other names. So that's why you might not have that information of the toxicities that can occur in those honeys. So to have a uniform definition is better, so people will get more accurate information, more information on the stingless bee honey itself. And also the standard can also include specific physicochemical properties, especially on the moisture level and reducing sugar content, which is unique to this type of honey compared to other types of honey. And the standards can also ensure contaminants and natural toxins that are unique also to the stingless bees can be assessed and regulated. This is because, as told you earlier, the stingless bees usually find the nectars from around 500 meters of their hives, from the plants 500 meters from the hives. So they're not unifloral honeys. They will take whatever plants that is within the area because that's what's available to them. So there can be other contaminants and natural toxins that we may not know of because there's no studies has been done on that. And also standards can actually increase international market penetration. There are demands from other countries based on the unique flavor of the stingless bee honeys. So if we can ensure that there a safe standard that can assess the safety of these honeys, there will be an increased market penetration around the world. And last but not least, standardization can also gives a better archives of scientific knowledge that are been published by scientists from around the world. Because when I did this study, I have to search for other studies by other scientists. I have to put in many different keywords because not all of them use Stingless Bee Honey and for their publications. Okay, so if we have all this standardization, we probably have a better archives of the scientific knowledge related. Okay, and in conclusion, I conclude that the standard is very important, and of course it will there are many. We need a lot of work by different people from the beekeepers, companies, business entities, okay, scientists, and governments, and also consumers to together find the best solution to make sure that we have a good and safe honey for consumption by producing a standard that can benefit to all of these people that have an interest on the Stingless Bee honeys. Okay, so with that, I thank you for listening to the presentation, and I hope that all this can actually give you an insight on what are the current status. And actually the standard in Malaysia also being revised to make sure that we're also helping the beekeepers and not making it harder for them to standardize their honeys. And here in Australia also, the Australian Native Bee Association is now working to apply for a standard for Stingless Bee honey. So yeah, we need a lot of input from other people as well. So thank you very much. Sorry? Okay. Oh, okay.
The audience has asked questions.
Oh, okay.
So does anyone have any questions for Nina? It's a very interesting topic. Everyone regards food as being safe, and it raises questions that you never thought. Yes, no.
I found it very informative, thanks. I was just wondering, in the beginning you did mention one of the problems with standards is the costs.
Is the, sorry?
Cost.
Cost, yes, that's right. Okay.
Of the measurement of these
Yeah,
parameters.
yeah, that's right.
And yet, towards the end, you did mention
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that need to be measured, and
Yeah,
some of these were the expensive
yeah,
ones.
yeah.
So, how are we going to get around that? Because a lot of the bee or the honey producers are maybe artisan and not huge commercial.
Yeah, yeah.
The more commercial ones in my mind are the pollinators, the people who travel around with bees to pollinate. So how are you going to get the standard linked to the producer's capacity to be able to pay?
Yeah, I think that's it's not really a matter of, thank you for asking the question. So I should repeat the question, right? Okay, because the people online cannot hear. So yeah, there's an issue with the for the beekeepers or companies, people, small farmers who are actually small farmers who cannot really afford to pay for the standard analysis. So I think it should be, the government should actually take into concern to that and probably set up like a center for this analysis of honey to make it cheaper. It can be made cheaper actually. It's actually more expensive because it is done individually. So actually those analyses can be made cheaper if there's actually a facilities that is focusing on analysis for honeys. So I think that the cost can actually be reduced once you get a mechanism to do, there's a mechanism to do that. Yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot my last slide actually. These are all the people that are in the Australian teams who are helped in the analysis, contribute to the samples. Tim Hurd is here, and Mary, Fletcher, and Natasha. Okay, which is their work is most on the present in alkaloids. And in Malaysian team, we have the Putra Kelulut and of course the standard group as well. And these are the people, the farmers, beekeepers that I work with. So these are Malaysian beekeepers. So this is why I enjoy this actually research, to be able to meet nice people. Okay, so the wonderful people, the beekeepers here from the ANBA Society in Queensland, and lots of beekeepers in Malaysia as well. Okay, any other question?